Hi everyone, this is a quick video for some updates and feedback. First, a few questions I've had about the film reviews. You are to do one film review for the week that you chose your top pick, right? So you only do one in the 7-week semester, and it's the video that you selected as your first choice. So for example, if you picked A League of Their Own as your top choice, so that means tomorrow you'll be turning in your film review. But if your top choice was in week 5, then you'll do it the Saturday of that week 5. So the dates will be clear on the schedule for all this, but I had a few questions about how many film reviews needed to be done and when they would be turned in. So again, that's the week that you picked your top pick, that's when you do the film review, and you only have to do one. I also noticed that some of the weekly prompts were confused about the Chicago Commission, especially as being either a secondary or primary source. What that means is we're reading some things this class that are first-hand accounts contemporary to whatever it was that they're talking about. So that Chicago Commission reading was a primary source. It wasn't something that a historian is arguing is an interpretation of an event, right? It's a source from the event itself. So just make sure you're keeping an eye on what kinds of readings you have in front of you so that you don't get confused in how you're making arguments about them. Let's also take a look at the quizzes. So a 72 class average for the first one. Let's take a look at some of the questions that gave you all difficulties. The first one was pretty easy. All you had to do was look up those pages where Gutman's talking about the characteristics of modern sport. But the second question gave some of you some difficulty. So the first answer says, because cultural imperialism is such an overwhelming force of domination, modern sports have always been used as a tool by powerful colonizers to transform colonial subjects. This is not the best answer because it's impossible to say that modern sports have always been a tool of domination. We know from some of the instances we came across in the reading of sports being reappropriated and used as a tool of anti-imperial statements or developing a culture that contests the other tools of domination that might be used by colonial forces or an empire. So the key term that should have tipped you off there is always. We're learning in many ways about how modern sports can be both simultaneously or can be one thing in one instance and one thing as another. We see baseball in the Caribbean, especially in week 2, being a good example of this, of a tool of a sport that is identified with the United States being used by people in the Caribbean to develop an identity that contests U.S. imperialism. The third answer, modern sports are never a tool of culture imperialism, is, again, similar reasons why this is not the best choice. There are ways that we can ignore that modern sports are caught up in colonial machinery in ways of a dominant imperial structure bringing in forms of culture that both colonizers and colonized recognize as being tools of cultural conversion, right? Of changing the way people behave in a kind of power relationship of culture being superior over another culture, right? So the second answer here is correct. Cultural hegemony is a more useful concept to understand the diffusion of modern sports because it signals the give and take nature of cultural exchange. And that's really kind of a meta lesson that I hope we keep returning to throughout the readings, is that relations of power are always complex, right? It's very few kinds of instances we can come up with where power is either absolute or it is complete domination. No question of resistance or acceptance or kind of collaboration happening in certain kinds of power relations. So cultural hegemony, the way Gutman describes it, I think is a great way for us to think about this give and take nature of cultural exchange and how power works in some complicated ways, especially in cultural arenas like sport. Question 3 was Again, a reading comprehension question: what factor does Hardy identify as an important material circumstance that shaped sports in the cities? And what we were looking for was free time there. Sewer systems aren't mentioned. Agricultural boom of 1903, something I made up. And federal funds for stadiums. It's something we're going to be looking at in this class, but it's not something that exists yet in the Hardy reading. How does Borish phrase the gendered ideas that shaped Beecher and Higginson's approach to exercise in sports? This should have, again, been a pretty easy one if you were paying attention to the reading. Muscular Christianity and Cult of Domesticity is what we were looking for. Mannishness is something that does come up in the reading, but ladytude is, again, something I made up. So the fifth question here, Kahn describes how female physical educators celebrated women's physical freedom and athletic enjoyment, but that this interest went hand in hand with what? And a wider political movement is something, a wider women's movement is something that Kahn does talk about, but it doesn't have anything to do with suffrage at the point in which we're talking about physical education, at least not in the way that Kahn is talking about it. The correct answer, preserving gender differences, is again something that Kahn is going to keep returning to, but we will in other content in the class as well. The idea that women entering the athletic space always butts up against differences in gender that both women and men are invested in either overturning or preserving. So Kahn's chapter, in the first week, is really talking about how physical educators were, in some senses, carving out a space for women's athletics because they were making the arguments that it was not a challenge to gender differences, that women playing sports would not transform them into men. So those are the answers for the first quiz that I wanted to point out to you. The second quiz, a little bit lower of a class average, so we can look at what problems people had in this quiz. The first question about baseball being introduced in Japan, you kind of had identified two parts here, so that might have tripped some of you up. But it was explicit, both ends of the answer were explicitly addressed by Gutman. The first is that it is a misconception that baseball arrives in the post-war occupation. This is something that Gutman's trying to argue that is incorrect, that we have to look earlier. So it is in the Meiji era that baseball arrives. And another thing that he wants to correct is that it wasn't for any reasons that it aligned with Japanese civic rituals of state. In fact, it was because it was not Japanese, because it was symbolized with modernity in the United States, that it spread quickly and especially took root in educational settings like we read about. So the first option here is sort of the most wrong, right? Because it's the two misconceptions that Gutman is working against. So again, those are kind of questions where you have to make sure you're understanding the author's arguments, and when you kind of see them step back and belabor a point, that's a good idea. That's a good moment to take a special note of. The National League, as it formed in the 19th century, so a couple things that it seemed like people got tripped up on. The first is Holbert is correct, right? This is a major figure that we learn about in the readings, but and in the first answer we have lopsided competition between large and small clubs, which also was a feature at moments of the National League, but it's not a distinguishing characteristic that Rees is talking about, the selection from Rees is talking about as the ideal of the National League, or what would come to be the stable form of the National League. Instead, that's something that the National League is trying to work against, lopsided competition. They want the most competitive teams all at the same level within one league, right? and controlled largely by players, that should have tipped many of you off to being the wrong answer, because a big point that is made in that reading as well is that while the previous large league was an association, because it was a players association essentially, that changes in the National League to give clubs more power. So the second answer is wrong because it identifies, or it says that Seymour thinks that this was democratic, and Seymour makes an argument about how this was undemocratic, and that this undemocratic nature of baseball actually continues to persist to the present day. The last answer is the correct one: controlled by large clubs, guided by Holbert, and fairly undemocratic. So the opposition between undemocratic and democratic in the second and fourth questions, when there is such a contradiction there where it has to be one or the other, make sure you go back into the reading and try and find where they're talking about that particular issue. Question 3, pretty much everyone got right. But question 4 was pretty tricky. So according to Kahn, which factors best, and I italicized best because I wanted to ask you a question about what are the determining factors for why the AAGBL and the NGBL don't exist today. So the second most popular answer, incorrect, was that the leagues were never a commercial success. Women's sports clashed with conservative cultures of the 1950s. One side of that is correct. Women's sports did clash with conservative culture of the 1950s, but the leagues were a commercial success. And in fact, we get a lot from Kahn to understanding what a big deal these leagues were, how many people attended them, how successful they were, especially in particular kinds of urban settings. And the player testimonies really should give you a sense of how commercially successful these leagues were at certain points, and how many people were coming out to cheer them on, and what it meant for these women to be able to earn a really good living off of playing a sport, which is something that comes across very strongly in the testimonials as something that kind of, it weirds them out. Like, I can't believe I'm doing what I love for money. So for that money to have been paid to them, there had to have been a period of commercial success. So that's hopefully where people who might have been on the fence about answering picked the first answer. The suburban exodus and growing popularity of television, there is a mention of suburban exodus in the reading, but television is not a factor at this point. So that should have been the factor, the portion of that question that tipped you off. So the correct answer was women's sports clashed with conservative culture of the 1950s, and the leagues had difficulty recruiting softball players. Kahn tells us at the end of that chapter that a big reason that the league had to fold was because women who were playing softball did not make the jump into baseball. So when things were becoming more of a commercial challenge, the problems with a healthy player base was, mounting to the problems with the league and the reason it closed down. Last question, most of you got right as well. A few of you got tripped up on the first and fourth options. The fourth option is incorrect because the MLBI is a creation of the MLB, something that doesn't come into being until much later in the 1920s. And the first answer is incorrect because it's really describing Gutman's reading. So if you maybe got confused about which reading I was asking you about, make sure you reread the question, and it's Klein's reading that we're talking about, and he doesn't talk about the kind of reinvention of the American sport and the symbolic ties to modernity in Japan and the Caribbean. So those are the quizzes, and I want to take the time to week go through the answers with you and point out what it is that I'm trying to get you to remember through the quizzes. Because really these are a smaller portion of your grade. They're nothing to lose sleep over, but they are a way for you just to kind of check in on yourself and make sure that you're getting out of the readings the important points that are going to help you write effective weekly papers. So think of this really as kind of a self-assessment of your reading comprehension and your ability to track what the important parts are that you can base a weekly response around. I also want to say something about the papers real quick, which is make sure you're providing plenty of examples and details. So if you structure your paper in a way that you lay out some abstract points, make sure you return to those points with some details and examples so we know what you're talking about. So don't always speak in generalities. Make a specific point about a detail that you found in the readings, or give an example of what you mean when you make a generalization. And then something that I did like seeing in the papers, for the most part, everyone did a really great job about answering all portions of the prompt. So make sure you read the prompt, make sure you read it closely, and make sure you're answering all parts of it. And again, most of you did a really great job on that, so I was happy to see. So a quick note about next week. We're going to have the readings up a little bit late, hopefully by Monday night, but it might be until Tuesday morning that we can't get the readings up to you. So in the schedule, you'll see, though, that week 3 has a couple of links that are to not the readings that we're scanning for the week. So start moving through those as soon as you're ready. So listen to the Backstory Radio podcast. It's really great. Read Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's piece on college athletes, and the Grantland article, Washington Post article, and the video from the Chronicle of Higher Education. If you have any questions, please let me know. Good luck on your film reviews, and good luck starting the week 3 content.